Woodwork Geek back here again, giving some feedback on the long video I did for this board. I thought I'd take the time to shorten it down to make it a little bit more acceptable for viewers. So here we go, a shortened version. So the video you can see here is me milling the timber down. So that was the biggest part of making these boards. I needed Iroko, ash, some Iroko different shade, yellow shade rather than the dark shade, and Sapele to make this board. So the way I started was to mill down each of those types of timber, first on the jointer, then the thicknesser, the table saw to bring them to width, and then on the drum sander just to finish them off, just to get them all so they're exactly the same size. I then glued them into panels, so I had flat panels for all of the different wood types, and then once I had the panels glued up, I could then cut those panels into end grain segments. This part of making the board took a lot longer than I expected. With 3 boards of all the different species, it took me a long time to get all of this down to the right thickness and ready. So as we all know, the most important thing with end grain boards is making sure the glue joints are tight and kind of no gaps. So having boards that have gone through the drum sander so that they are perfectly flat across all the surface is one of the most important things for me, and want to kind of ensure that the board lasts as long as it should do. I've not shown all of the milling work here because there was hours and hours of footage, but in essence I do it for all the different wood types. Here you can see me cutting down one of the ash planks into the end grain strips. This section is really important to make sure you get all the same heights for all of them. So once you set the sledge, it's worth cutting all of the material with the same setting so that when you come to glue the block up into a board, everything's the same dimension. After everything's been cut through the sled, I then take off all the nibs with a bit of sandpaper. Again, this is just so you get a really good tight end grain. Here you can see me reversing pieces so that you get a grain pattern that kind of matches across those bits, try and make it as pretty as possible. Each of my glue ups is left overnight just to make sure that everything's tight, and once it's glued up I take the bits of glue off, and then I have to dimension each of those pieces down to the right thickness. So for the Union Jack you need 3 centimeter pieces of ash, 1 centimeter pieces of ash, and then you need 2 centimeter pieces of ash to go around the edge of the Union Jack rectangles in the corners. You need 6 centimeter Sapele for the cross, you need 2 centimeter Sapele for the Union Jacks, and then you need 5 centimeters of Iroko for each of the Ukrainian flags, 20 centimeters long, and you also need the Iroko dark shade for the blue parts of the Union Jack corners. So all of that needs to be cut and dimensioned. I use the drum sander to get each part so that it's perfectly accurate, so that you know that you have 3 centimeter, 1 centimeter pieces of ash and 2 centimeter pieces of ash. So when you make those corners, all the dimensions are perfect, because a flag needs to be dimensionally correct, and I was using the 5'3" dimension, so that's what works out for this. So it's a 50 centimeter board by a 30 centimeter board, and that's what those calculations are based off. The next part here is gluing up the rectangular corners for the Union Jack. So this is by far the most complicated part of the board. So here I take the dark Iroko, the ash, Sapele for the red, and the Iroko for the blue corners, and I cut them into kind of dimensions, as I said, and then glue them up like this to try and minimize that wastage. As I was making 3 boards, that was 6 corners needed. Because I did the diagonals, they were all the same type, which made it a little bit easier to manage. Here I am just machining up the Ukrainian corners. So here's the yellow shade Iroko. This is kind of 1/2 of the Union Jack side. So glue it all up, scrape the glue off. Same with the Iroko. After doing that, I then put them through my planer flattening jig, and you'll see that in a minute. Same as with the Union Jack corners. In order to get a reference surface, I put them on my flattening jig, which then gives me a perfect reference surface to then build from. Once the Union Jack corners are sorted, I then moved on to doing the Ukrainian corners. So I've glued up the Ukrainian blocks. I cut them down on the bandsaw to get the 5cm strips, and then I glue those strips together to make the corners for the Ukrainian side of the Union Jack. So that then gives me the 6 corners that I need for the Ukrainian parts of the flag, and then the 6 corners for the Union Jack side of the flag. Once they're all glued up and finished, they go through the drum sander just to clean up the surfaces, and then after the drum sander, the key part then is to dimension the Union Jack corners. So this was one of the most difficult parts for me in terms of I started with a ruler and a pencil, but it ended up making this template. That template I then put on the pieces of wood and traced around the outside to then give me the rough dimensions. So I kind of cut within a millimetre of the line, and then I used the disc sander to trim them up. If I did it again, I would go straight to a chop saw and straighten it up on the chop saw and the table saw. The disc sander I didn't feel gave me quite a straight enough set of edges to glue the board, so I ended up redoing some of this on the chop saw and table saw later in the video. Once everything is properly dimensioned, the next stage is to test fit all the pieces. So this is a particularly complex kind of board, so you really do need to make sure that each of these joints is kept as close and tight together as you possibly can. Any discrepancy in any of these cuts causes problems, which is why you can see here I'm kind of trimming up the Ukrainian pieces on the table saw, and you'll actually see me do the same with some of the Union Jack pieces here, just because I wasn't comfortable with the kind of disc sanders accuracy. It wasn't bad, but it just wasn't quite up to my standards. Here you can see me just running through the table saw, so I know they're all the right thickness, so that when I clamp the board together I've got equal pressure on all the joints and it works as it should do. When it comes to kind of testing the board for dry fit, I think this is where really you shouldn't cut any corners. Each of these pieces needs to be a perfect joint without having to clamp the board within an inch of its life, so that when you get to this glue stage, the board just goes together nice and tightly without having to exert undue pressure. Here you can see my bespoke clamping jig. So it's a metal frame with screws on 2 sides, and I then use those screws to apply pressure to some blocks that then clamp that board in 2 directions at the same time. A very handy piece of kit. Here I'm taking the glued up board. I've kind of already flattened and drum sanded it. I didn't make you watch any of that footage, but here I'm just trimming it to final size. So this is where it gets to the 50 by 30, so I'm just making sure the table saw is set up for proper right angle cuts, and then trim that board. The key part here is that the red diagonals in the Union Jack have to die exactly in the corner of the board, which is easier said than done when you're trying to make it to an exact size. Luckily to say, my machining was pretty good, so I was within a millimetre of my final dimension, so I was more than happy. Here I'm putting some handles on the boards. these boards are quite heavy at about 5.5 kilos, so a decent handholds are absolutely vital. So I tend to use a router and flush fluted bit to then kind of mill out each of the handles with a handy little jig. I then bevel all the corners with 45 degrees just to keep them kind of not too sharp at edge. Then it's on to sanding. Sanding is the killer for these boards. They've already been through the drum sander, so the boards are flat on top down to about 120 grit. But it does take a considerable amount of time, even with the Festool Rotax, to flatten it. I use the Rotax on the top and bottom, and then the other sander you saw there was the RTS 400. That's the one that I then use for the edges and the handles. All in all, seems to be a good system. As always, constantly evolving. I think the next change will be different grip or different types of sandpaper. I currently use the Festool Rubens sandpaper, but I'm going to try the 3M Cubitron next, because apparently that cuts faster and for longer. All in all, there was like 5-6 hours of sanding in these boards, so this 15-20 seconds that you'll see here is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of finishing these boards to a perfect standard. I do 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, 220, 320 with water pots from 180 to 220 and 320 before I then finish with Osmo oil. So here you can see me oiling it. I use two types of Osmos these days. So I use the extra thin to start, just to get a bit more penetration into the board, and then I use Osmo's top oil. I'm not personally a fan of mineral oil and kind of beeswax at the minute. It takes too long to finish the boards. I find you have to let them soak, then you have to let them seep, and then you have to put the conditioner in. With the Osmos, I can just oil it and buff it within 15 minutes, and then I'm on to the next task. And I've been using Osmos on my personal boards at home for 2 years with no problem. Here are the final boards, and as you can see, they really are something special. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. If you like this, then subscribe and give me any feedback. I'm always welcome to take both negative and positive feedback, and hopefully those that have commented before will see that I've taken that on board into this video.